Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. That was a lovely introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here. But I don't want to look at myself. Let me see if I... my talk is entitled Art's Bad Boys, and you're certainly justified in wondering what exactly I mean. How do I define bad? Do I mean an artist whose social behavior raises eyebrows? A wife beater? A family deserter? A murderer? A revolutionary bent on overthrowing the government? Or do I mean an artist who makes deeply offensive art, who forsakes the time-honored Renaissance rules of perspective, who paints or draws objects as he wishes, where near is far away and right side up becomes upside down? Or do I speak of the painter who cavalierly discards colors as they are seen in nature and uses them arbitrarily as his mood dictates? Or am I referencing the jokesters or pranksters of the art world? Well, in truth, I speak of all of them. Just as in politics or commerce, art has always had its share of men and women whose lifestyles or work ethics or both have managed to shock, even to enrage, both the critics and the public. I can name, without much difficulty, at least a dozen or more artists who did exactly that. And I'm sure that you, without too much effort, can easily add other names to this list. Of course, the name that comes immediately to mind, the name that fits into just about each of the categories just described, is Pablo Picasso. I grew up in New York City, and I remember the first time that I saw this painting, Picasso's Guernica, at the Museum of Modern Art. Today it's back in Spain, in Madrid, hanging in La Reina Sofia. How many of you have seen this masterpiece? Guernica is not a pretty picture. It's not a landscape painted in soft pastels. It's not a portrait of beautifully dressed people picnicking in a glade. It is instead a canvas, a monumental canvas of suffering, of anguish, of screaming women, of dismembered body parts. And center stage, you see a gored horse, painted in tones of black and gray and white. Guernica was Picasso's anti-war canvas. He sent it to New York before World War II to get it out of Spain and to keep it from falling into the hands of Franco, the dictator bent on crushing democracy in Picasso's native land. I think it was then that I became a Picasso fan and believed him to be the most important painter in the world. Although I confess there have been many, many times I awarded the same title to Henri Matisse. But today, in this Me Too era, it has become increasingly common to question Picasso's status as the greatest artist of the 20th century and to castigate him because of the way he treated or mistreated the women in his life. In fact, not so long ago, Deborah Solomon, a respected art critic, wrote a piece for the Sunday New York Times questioning her own feelings about Picasso, love or hate. There's little doubt that Picasso's well-documented relationship with the women in his life does provoke sighs, but I think that one has to separate Picasso's personal behavior from his creative achievements. That is, separate the art from the artist. A situation, my granddaughter told me, comparable to the way in which the singer-performer Michael Jackson arouses both controversy and admiration. In the past year alone, there have been 40+ exhibitions throughout Europe and America celebrating Picasso. And the subject that appears most often in those exhibitions is women. Picasso's artistic production was gargantuan. During his lifetime, he made an estimated 13,500 paintings, plus thousands of drawings, prints, sculptures, and ceramics. His art was constantly innovative and consistently spectacular. And that is why I am a fan of Pablo Picasso, the artist. Picasso studied women. He recorded them meticulously, sometimes as vulnerable as in the 1901 painting over there of a young mother clutching her infant and gripping the hand of her toddler. And in 1906, he painted his friend, the American expatriate Gertrude Stein, as a majestic presence. But focus on her face. It differs dramatically in style from the body and the hands. The features are so severely drawn that Gertrude looks more like a primitive stone sculpture than a human being. In 1937, he painted his mistress, blonde, voluptuous Marie-Thérèse at your right, eyes closed in some sort of an interior reverie. And that same year, 1937, he painted Dora Maar, another one of his many, many mistresses, by combining a frontal and profile view with her eyes facing in different directions. But this afternoon's talk is not a Picasso lecture. My subject today is art's bad boys. I promise, if there's time, to return to Picasso later. Let me begin with Maurizio Cattelan and his contribution to the 2019 Miami Art Basel Fair. He was the artist whose work, the comedian, provoked multiple reactions: knitted brows, puzzled frowns, laughter, even outrage. The work consisted of a banana duct taped to the wall. That's it in front of you. And at the left, there is Maurizio Cattelan, the artist. 3 editions of Cattelan's duct-taped banana sold. Each of the first 2 editions sold for $120,000. The 3rd edition sold for $150,000. Each buyer received a certificate of authenticity signed and stamped by the artist. And Cattelan, grinning all the way to the bank, had to be thrilled with his financial windfall. Cattelan has been poking fun at the art establishment for quite a while. 23 years earlier, in 2001, he created this installation, Man Coming Up Through the Floor. The man, Maurizio Cattelan, of course, doesn't seem a bit surprised to find himself in an art museum specializing in old masters. In 2016, Cattelan installed a functioning 18-karat gold toilet in the Guggenheim Museum. Museum visitors queued up to see it and to use it if they wished. Each visitor was permitted 3 minutes of privacy. Cattelan entitled his work America. I think that the toilet summarizes Cattelan's feelings about the American dream, as well as his perception of its artistic worth. The gold toilet's exalted value contrasts dramatically with its basic lowly function as a waste disposer. I have a postscript. 3 years later, in 2019, Cattelan's America was installed as part of an exhibition in Blenheim Palace, once upon a time the ancestral home of the Churchill family. And guess what? It was stolen. Shortly after the robbery, Cattelan told the New York Times that he thought it was just a prank. I wonder, had he really forgotten that his piece was made of gold and worth $6 million? Now, 2 Novembers ago, 4 years after the theft, the thieves were finally caught. My question to you, my audience, is Cattelan an artist, or is he a skeptic making fun of us? I leave it to you to decide. But now let me tell you about an earlier art world prankster, Marcel Duchamp. There he is, Marcel Duchamp, wine glass in hand, smiling impishly out at us, and posed behind what seems to be a wheel. In 1917, a century before Maurizio Cattelan began making headlines, Marcel Duchamp submitted the work of the left to the Society of Independent Artists, a group headquartered in New York City. What was it? Well, it was a urinal turned upside down. Duchamp entitled it Fountain. Well, it does sort of look like a fountain, doesn't it? He signed and dated it Art Mute, and he referred to it as a ready-made. Do you think that Duchamp's upside-down urinal might have been the inspiration for Cattelan's gold toilet? I do. 4 years earlier, in 1913, Duchamp had created an artwork he entitled Bicycle Wheel. What was it? Well, it was a bicycle wheel attached to an ordinary kitchen stool. Visitors were encouraged to spin the wheel and watch it turn. And again, Duchamp referred to it as a ready-made. Now, art historians have defined ready-mades as ordinary objects elevated to the dignity of a work of art by the designation of the artist. So, in other words, by removing that wheel from its bicycle and affixing it to the stool, or turning a urinal upside down and signing it, these works become works of art. Why? Because the artist says these are works of art. Again, the same question. Is the artist poking fun at us? 12 or more bicycle wheels, ready-mades, were created by Marcel Duchamp, each one with a letter of authentication, made by Duchamp. Just like any other worker in the industrial age, Duchamp was creating a product to meet the demands of the market. Does that sound familiar? It's exactly the same idea as the multiple versions of the duct-taped banana. Maybe even the origin of the idea? In 1919, Marcel Duchamp took a cheap postcard copy of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, and he added a mustache above her lip and a goatee to her chin. Not satisfied with these additions, he added the initials LHOOQ below, essentially giving this hallowed, centuries-old work an undeniably crude title. Let's see, can you see it? Over here, LHOOQ, yeah. Pronouncing the letters LHOOQ in French, LHOOQ, translates into, well, the only polite way to say it would be, she's really a hot babe. Believe me, it's far more vulgar. Duchamp's ready-mades were nothing more than mass-produced functional objects that he, Duchamp, the artist, designated as art, thus challenging the accepted notion that art should reflect an artist's skill, should be handcrafted by the artist. Duchamp asserted that an artist could make art simply by making choices. His ready-mades aimed at shifting the viewer's engagement from what Duchamp called the retinal, that is, pleasing to the eye, to the intellectual, in the service of the mind. And in this way, he subverted the traditional notion that beauty had to be a defining characteristic of art. I personally think it's fair to say that Duchamp's ready-mades had a huge influence on the conventional understanding of art and paved the way for future revolutionary artists. And in fact, while Duchamp made his mark at the beginning of the 20th century, Jeff Koons, the American artist, would catapult to fame with his ready-mades at the end of the 20th century. Let me show you. This is Jeff Koons. Frankly, he looks more like a Wall Street broker than an artist. Koons's first solo exhibition was held in 1980. People strolling by the entrance of the new museum in New York City might have noticed a series of vacuum cleaners in its windows. The display was so masterfully done and so cleverly lighted that people passing by went into the museum to ask about buying the vacuums on display. At least that's what I heard. Now, look to the right. What do you see? Again, this is Duchamp's creation of 1915, and its title is In Advance of the Broken Arm. You see a snow shovel suspended from the ceiling. Duchamp called it art. Again, this is Duchamp making the viewer focus not on the retinal, something identified by the eye, but on the intellectual, something known by the mind, that one's arm, if not broken, would surely ache if used to shovel heavy, wet snow. Again, by this alteration, Duchamp overturns the traditional notion that beauty must be a necessary component of art. Critics often draw parallels between Koons's and Duchamp's use of ready-made, everyday objects recontextualized as art. In fact, about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a show in Mexico City that demonstrated how both of these artists, Koons and Duchamp, bookends of the 20th century, were motivated by the exact same idea. They both used ready-mades to provoke questions about taste, class, eroticism, sexuality, and consumerism. Jeff Koons is a hard worker and exceedingly ambitious. The success that he made with his ready-mades in 1981 made him hungry for more. 10 years later, in 1991, Koons found an opportunity. He'd heard about an Italian porn star who was, believe it or not, also a very successful politician. In fact, she was a bona fide member of the Italian Senate. Her name is Ilona Staller. You may know of her. He succeeded in reaching her and convincing her to pose with him for a series of large photographs he entitled Made in Heaven. And he created the billboard poster that you're looking at for New York's Whitney Museum of Art. In November 1991, the exhibition itself opened at the Sonnabend Gallery in New York City. For the series, Koons had himself and Ilona photographed in multiple explicit sexual positions that would, as they say, make a sailor blush. Ilona, also known as La Ciccolina or Cuddles, later became his wife, and they had a son named Ludwig. The works were, of course, highly provocative. In fact, this particular image is the only one of the series that I can actually show you. The photographs showed the couple in every sexual position you can imagine, and some, I promise you, you could not. The images were, according to Koons, this you'll love, designed to examine the place of sexuality in the visual arts. But by blurring the boundaries between fine art and pornography, Koons effectively threw down the gauntlet and challenged the definition of art and smut. In my opinion, there's no gray area in Koons's Made in Heaven. You can either call it absurd or brilliant. You can either label it outright pornography or high art. I personally agree with the New York Times art critic Michael Kimmelman, who described it as self-promoting hype and shameless sensationalism. I'll bet you that Kimmelman didn't take his kids to see that show. Now, let's return to the early part of the 20th century, to the artist Man Ray. Emanuel Radnitsky, or Man Ray, was born in Philadelphia in 1890 to immigrant parents. As a young man, he decided he was going to be an artist. He changed his name to Man Ray. It's the second syllable of his first name and the first syllable of his last. He moved to Paris. That's where the art world was. And there he worked as both a photographer and a painter. He became a key figure in the Dada and Surrealist movements. Man Ray greatly admired the French neoclassic artist Jean-Auguste Ingres. So maybe inspired by Ingres' paintings of languorous nudes lying around in Persian harems, he posed his lover at the time, a model named Kiki de Montparnasse. You see her at the right. She's wearing a turban, but not much else. The title is Le Violon d'Ingres. It gives us a clue. Translated from the French, le violon d'Ingres is an idiom that means hobby. The title suggests that Kiki is Man Ray's very special hobby. That photograph sold at Christie's in May 2022 for $12.4 million, and it became the most expensive photograph ever sold at auction. At your left, Man Ray's self-portrait with gun, 1932. It's certainly Man Ray. Notice that he has a rope around his neck. You see it? A gun aimed at his head, a clock, a cigarette lighter, seemingly bent on self-destruction. Why? His lover, the famous American model Lee Miller, had left him, and he was despondent. But I assure you that he did not commit suicide. Instead, he took a selfie, that selfie, and he died peacefully in 1976 at the ripe old age of 86. This next section is about an English street artist and political activist named Banksy. Notice, I don't have a photograph of Banksy to show you. Very little is known about Banksy himself, as he refuses to be interviewed or photographed. He's regarded as the world's greatest street artist, and he's known for his anti-authoritarian art. He delights in remaining a famous mystery man. His collectors voice an intense desire to unveil him, but so far as I know, no one has ever seen or ever acknowledged having met him. In October 2018, Banksy's Girl with the Red Balloon, that's it over there at the right, it went up at auction at Sotheby's in London. Announcements of the sale had generated intense interest, and the excitement in the room was palpable. The bidding was animated, and when the hammer finally came down, the auctioneer proudly announced that that little picture of the girl with the red balloon had sold for £1 million. Remember, it's a little picture. But seconds after the hammer came down, this £1 million painting began a curious, solitary journey down and out of its frame. Hidden in the frame was a shredder. Half the picture was spliced and destroyed before the shredder malfunctioned and stopped. And so Banksy's Girl with the Red Balloon became the first recorded example of a self-destructing work of art. Banksy posted a video to his Instagram confirming that the destruction was artist-inflicted and absolutely intentional. So much for the jokesters and pranksters of the art world. Now, let's focus on two earlier artists, much earlier. One, an exquisite painter, and the other, an extraordinary sculptor. But both men incapable of controlling either their emotions or their tempers. I'm talking about Maurizio de Caravaggio and Benvenuto Cellini. Photography, of course, didn't exist in the 17th century, so the only image I have of Caravaggio is that self-portrait before you. He was born in 1571, and he died at the age of 39 in 1610. His life was short and tempestuous, and it was filled with Sturm und Drang and perfectly matched the drama and intensity of his paintings. Caravaggio was arrogant and rebellious. He had frequent run-ins with the authorities. He was arrested and tried in a court of law at least 11 times. Why, you're wondering? What could he have done? Well, among his crimes were writing libelous poems, throwing a plate of artichokes at a waiter, assaulting people with his sword, not so serious. Eventually, however, his temper got the best of him and he murdered a man in a street fight. Forced to flee Rome, he died in exile. But his paintings, they are gorgeous. They're stunning. They're dramatic. They are characterized by something that was brand new at the time, a heightened form of theatrical lighting, or chiaroscuro. Caravaggio's work was hugely influential on succeeding generations all over Europe. Let me show you a few. At your left is Caravaggio's 1601 painting of young Cupid, the personification of love. You can see Cupid gleefully engaged in breaking and kicking about various objects that represent music and science and fame and power. The interpretation of this painting is that love, that is Cupid, is the strongest force on earth, stronger than music or science or fame or power. In fact, love conquers all, or amor vincit omnia, was the name given to the painting some years later. At the right, you see a boy with a basket of fruit. Here you see a splendid example of chiaroscuro. Notice how Caravaggio illuminates the right side of the boy's face and his shoulder and the fruits. Now look carefully at the faces of the two youths. They are most definitely not the faces of young gods or idealized, high-born young men. These are local street urchins, happy to earn a few scudos in return for posing for Caravaggio. This painting is entitled The Card Sharks. Caravaggio finished it in 1595. You see two men engaged in a game of cards. The dupe, right here, the victim, the young man at your left, wears a dark brown doublet or jacket, and as you can see, he's totally focused on his cards. Behind him stands the older of the two thieves, busy signaling to his partner, the young man at the right, who's about to pull the winning card from out of his waistband. You have to admire Caravaggio's skill in such small details as the accomplice's torn glove. You see his fingers peeping out from the torn gloves, and you have to admire the beautiful embroidery on the cuffs and the collar of the victim's outfit. This is Caravaggio's Doubting St. Thomas. It was painted around 1601. Before Caravaggio, no artist had ever composed an image with such an intense focus on Christ's wound. Here, however, you see Christ allowing Thomas to insert his finger inside the wound. There's no blood, but this image is just about as visceral as it gets. But if you thought the last painting packed a wallop, focus now on Caravaggio's Old Testament heroine, Judith. She's in the process of separating Holofernes' head from his neck. Frowning, but determined, Judith has plunged the blade into Holofernes. His open mouth breathes its last as blood streams from the wound. Judith's faithful maidservant looks on impassively. She spreads her apron, ready to catch the general's head. This is harsh, but spectacular realism. The strong contrasts of light and dark, the chiaroscuro, only add to the intensity of the moment. When we think of a badly behaved Renaissance artist, it's always Caravaggio who springs immediately to mind, famed as much for his violent temper as his spectacular paintings. Caravaggio, however, looks almost like a choir boy when compared to the Florentine goldsmith and sculptor Benvenuto Cellini. Unfortunately, the only image of Benvenuto Cellini that I have is this bust on the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. But Cellini was not just an artist. He was so many other things. He was a poet, a soldier, a musician, and a priest. He committed murder 3 times. He was convicted of sodomy twice. He was accused of stealing the Pope's jewels, but pardoned. He was poisoned, but survived. Cellini worked for the greatest rulers of the time in Florence and in Rome and in Mantua. And in France, his client was none other than Francis I, the King of France. Cellini created this sculpture. I'm sure you know it. It's Perseus with the head of Medusa, and it's in the Piazza della Signoria in Florence. The bronze sculpture represents the Greek hero Perseus victoriously holding aloft the severed head of the dreaded Gorgon Medusa. I show you a detail of Medusa at the right. Cellini depicts his Medusa in all her macabre glory. Snakes in embracing ringlets crown that detached head. And blood in graceful waves streams from her neck, and you can see that clearly over there, and from her body over there at the left. This sculpture relates not only a mythological tale, but it also conveyed a political message to the citizens of Florence. Perseus here represents the power of the Florentine duke who had successfully defeated the Republic. And Medusa, well, she symbolizes the failed Republican experiment, and the snakes coming out of her head are the discords that have always affected democracy. It kind of sounds familiar, like a dysfunctional government like ours. Cellini also created some of the most exquisite silver and gold objects of art ever seen. Before you is a salt cellar, fashioned out of gold and enamel. Salt, you see, was a luxury in the 16th century, and objects like this were made for royalty. In fact, this salt cellar was made expressly for Francis I, King of France. Sadly, not many of Cellini's works in gold and silver have survived because, made from precious materials, they were melted down for bullion in later centuries. This is interesting. A few years ago, a Russian oligarch turned art historian claims to have discovered a Cellini self-portrait. Now, since no paintings of or by Cellini are known to exist, this portrait, if authentic, would turn everything that we know about Cellini as an artist on its head. I show you the portrait the Russian oligarch claims as authentic. We await the expert's opinion. Let's move now to France in the middle of the 19th century. This is a self-portrait of Gustave Courbet. You would be correct in thinking that Courbet depicts himself here as mad or teetering at the edge of sanity, the quintessential romantic artist, a tortured genius struggling for recognition. Before you stands a young woman viewing Courbet's painting. It's entitled The Origin of the World. It's dated 1866, and it's in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Is it provocative? Well, of course it's provocative. That's why I placed a museum visitor in front of it while I tell you its background story. When it was first shown in 1866, it shocked Courbet's contemporaries with its clinical observation of a woman's thighs and torso. Scholars, however, viewing it, thought it both as, or viewed it both as anticipating the erotic humor of Marcel Duchamp and acknowledging the human penchant for voyeurism. And even though we think that nothing can shock us today, 150 years later, I think that this work can still startle. In a moment, that young woman in front of the painting we'll move on, and you can decide for yourselves if it's provocative. Here's what shocked the Parisian elite. What do you think? But Courbet's propensity for shock was not limited to canvas and paint. Let me give you a little background. At the center of the Place Vendôme, you know it well, I'm sure, in the heart of Paris, stands the Vendôme column. It's almost, but not quite, 150 feet high, and spiraling up its surface are 425 bas-reliefs commemorating Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz. At its summit stands Napoleon. He's dressed as a Roman emperor, enjoying a commanding view of Paris on a sunny day. I hasten to assure you, however, that Courbet was most definitely not a fan of Napoleon. In fact, in 1871, Gustave Courbet led the revolutionary group that toppled the monument. At the left, you see a print commemorating that event. And Courbet, that's his photograph at the right, was both a great realist painter and what the French call an homme sauvage, a wild man, another way of saying a really, really bad boy. He was a major force of the Communards, a revolutionary group who viewed the column as representing not only the spirit of war, but the detested imperial dynasties of the two Napoleons. For this rebellious act, Courbet received both a fine and a 6-month prison sentence. And 2 years later, in 1873, the French Republic decided to re-erect the column. And not satisfied with its initial punishment of Courbet, the government decreed that Courbet was to pay off the costs of re-erecting the column at the rate of 10,000 francs a year, or about $250,000 in today's currency, until his 91st birthday in 1922. Financially ruined, Courbet had no choice but to flee France. He sought refuge in Switzerland, and not surprisingly, the combination of France's relentless persecution and alcohol proved lethal, and Courbet died at the age of 58. Édouard Manet was a French modernist who, if not the first, was among the first of the 19th century artists to paint modern life. However, both his painting style and his subject matter were considered radical, shocking. Both of these paintings are entitled Woman with Parrot. Both are dated 1866. Both are on view at New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art. The one at the left is by Édouard Manet. The one at the right is by bad boy Courbet. Focus your attention first on the Courbet. It's very large. It's over 6 feet wide and it's 4 feet high. His nude is sprawled horizontally across that entire canvas. Her long auburn hair spreads fan-like over the coverlet. Her legs, too, are spread. She plays with her parrot, and she leaves nothing to the imagination. You see the parrot? Yeah. This work is overtly erotic. Now look over at Manet's Woman with a Parrot. Manet has posed Victorine Morin, his favorite model, standing next to the parrot, and the parrot's very well behaved. You see he's standing on his stand there. She wears a shimmering pink satin dressing gown. A locket on a black velvet ribbon adorns her throat. But notice, in her right hand, she holds a bunch of violets, and in her left hand, she's playing with a monocle. We wonder, are the violets a gift from a suitor? And the suitor, did he leave his monocle behind? The sexuality is certainly there, but it is implied, far different, far more subtle than in the Courbet. When Manet's Picnic on the Grass of 1862 was exhibited, it caused an uproar. It was harshly criticized and condemned. Why? Well, obviously, a picnic in the park is a fine subject, and the two well-dressed men were perfectly fine as well. The public, however, was outraged by the behavior of the gentleman's female companion. Why? Well, this woman evidently has few inhibitions. She's just shed her clothes and tossed them to the side. This is no shy wood nymph who has magically materialized. It is instead a young woman whose state of undress suggests that she's been brought along as dessert. By the way, the discarded dress and the straw hat and the picnic basket in the lower left-hand corner make a lovely composition. 3 years later, in 1865, Claude Monet painted his version of a picnic, but he entitled it not Picnic, Luncheon on the Grass. The titles differ, but just ever so slightly. Monet has given us a luncheon, Manet a picnic. But notice that all of Monet's participants are fully clothed. Here's my question. Did Monet conceive his painting as an homage to Manet or as a rebuttal? Personally, I think it was clearly a desire on Monet's part to distance himself from Manet. In 1863, a year after Picnic made its scandalous debut, Manet submitted this painting to the Salon. He entitled it Olympia, and again, it elicited howls of rage from the critics. Olympia features a nude woman, again his favorite model, Victorine Mouron. She reclines on a cushioned chaise lounge. A small black cat, right here, can you see it? Sits at her feet, and a servant, also black, enters carrying an extravagant bouquet of flowers. A gift from a happy client, one who's just left, or maybe one who is on his way. But what was so appalling to the critics was that this was no mythological Venus, but instead a real woman, clearly a prostitute, matter-of-factly parading her wares and looking boldly straight at us. If there was any lingering doubt, the inclusion of that cat, a symbol of promiscuity, and the name Olympia were easily recognized by the 19th century viewer as code for love for sale. Now, contrast that painting, Manet's Olympia, with what I'm about to show you. This is Titian's Venus of Urbino, right there, this gorgeous painting. Manet, of course, knew Titian's masterpiece very well, and he used it as his inspiration to emphasize his rejection of the past. Notice that Titian's Venus has a dog, the symbol of fidelity, at her feet, not a cat. And the two maidservants in the background are busy folding her trousseau into a chest. She is about to be wed, and unlike Olympia, she is most definitely not a woman for hire. Looking at this photograph, you would be correct in thinking that this gentleman was a comfortable family man, a bourgeois Parisien. And indeed, that is what Paul Gauguin was until he wasn't. Rejecting his career as a stockbroker, abandoning Paris, abandoning his wife and 5 children, Gauguin dove headfirst into life as an artist, first in Pont-Aven, then briefly in the south of France with Vincent van Gogh, and finally, turning his back on European society, he began his love affair with the South Pacific. He married, well, it wasn't really a Christian marriage. He married a young, very young Polynesian girl. She was, I think, 13 or 14. And he settled in the Marquesas, where he painted, he sculpted, and he wrote. He died in 1903 at the age of 55. His friendship with Van Gogh is well recorded. It was brief, believe me, it was brief and it was sad. In 1888, Vincent van Gogh, touting the exquisite light in the south of France, convinced Gauguin to come and paint with him in Arles. And as we know, the visit ended disastrously, with Van Gogh slicing off a healthy portion of his ear and Gauguin swiftly taking his leave. Before you, two of Van Gogh's works from that period. At the left, self-portrait with bandaged ear, or at least what was left of it. And at the right, the night cafe at Arles, Madame Genoux, the proprietress, front and center. Gauguin considered the picture at your left, The Spirit of the Dead, 1892, one of the best of his early Tahitian paintings. The work depicts his young lover lying belly down on the bed, staring out at the viewer. Behind the bed and in profile sits a mysterious form. Do you see it right here? An outer worldly spirit. The spirit of the dead. At the right, Tahitian Woman with Flower, 1891. Here, Gauguin dresses the young woman in European clothes, but her exotic looks coupled with the bright colors of the background make this unlike any traditional European portrait. Both of these paintings show two women sitting on a beach resting, but the titles of the paintings, as well as the subject's attire or lack of, are strikingly different. At the left, the women sit together, but they don't face each other. Both are dressed and lost in their own thoughts. Tahitian Women on the Beach is his title. And at the right, the two young women sit, again, not facing each other. One wears a wreath of flowers in her hair. Are You Jealous is the provocative title of the picture. The girls, we learn, are sisters. The object of the jealousy, alas, we shall never know, but we can guess. I didn't want to abandon Van Gogh and his bandaged ear in Arles, so I thought to end this segment with Starry Night. Van Gogh painted it in 1889 while confined to an asylum in Saint-Rémy. The violent thrust of the cypress trees into that agitated sky filled with swirling stars and a spinning moon accurately reflect, I think, the artist's convulsive state of mind. At the beginning of the 20th century, Paris was the center of the art world, and so Amedeo Modigliani, Italian by birth, became Parisian by choice. There he discovered the work of Renoir and Degas and Gauguin and the younger set, the up-and-coming artists, Matisse and Picasso. He was handsome, delicate of health. He was tubercular. He lived life at the edge. He drank too much, and he recklessly consumed a deadly combination of hashish and opium. He was the epitome of the doomed artist, l'artiste maudit. In 1917, he had his first one-man show at the Bert Weil Gallery in Paris. In the window was a painting of a slender young woman resting on a blue cushion. We see nothing objectionable about the picture, but within a few hours of the opening, the police were summoned and the show was closed. Why? Nudes had been shown for centuries. Eyes open, eyes closed, sitting, standing, reclining, but with pubic hair? Never. Well, hardly ever. Of course, you will remember that 50 years earlier, Gustave Courbet had scandalized the Parisian public with his exquisitely detailed torso, The Origin of the World. And where is that painting today? It hangs in a place of honor in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. And Modigliani's nude, I'd love to say that it hangs in the next gallery, but actually it's in a private collection in Milan. But that same year, 1917, Modigliani met young Jean Hébuterne, the beautiful blue-eyed woman in the portrait before you. Although Modigliani continued to paint, his health was deteriorating rapidly. He was just 35 years old when he died in January 1920. And Hébuterne, pregnant with their second child, was inconsolable, and she threw herself out of a fifth-floor window. I don't think that during his lifetime, Modigliani ever sold a painting for more than a few francs. How ironic that in May 2018, this 1917 Modigliani nude that you're looking at sold at Sotheby's for $157 million. And now to Henri Matisse, one of the two giants of 20th century art. Matisse's early work was a radical departure from anything that had ever been seen before. In 1905, Matisse exhibited his work at the Salon d'Automne in Paris, and one of the paintings was this one of his wife. It's Madame Matisse. She's wearing an elaborate hat, feathers and flowers of every color, and her face is highlighted in greens and pinks. The highly respected art critic, Louis Vaucel, was horrified by Matisse's undisciplined choice of colors and exclaimed that this work was tantamount to throwing a pot of paint into the public's face. That, in fact, it was like putting a wild beast, a fauve, next to a Donatello. And that is how a new style of painting in explosive colors, having nothing whatsoever to do with reality, was baptized Fauvism. 2 years later, in 1907, Matisse painted Blue Nude, Memory of Biskra. This picture was the exact opposite of the languorous oriental nudes the public was accustomed to seeing. This nude harkens back to Michelangelo and his muscular sculptures on the Medici tombs in Florence. At the right, I show you a detail of Michelangelo's Medici tomb. You can see the resemblance right there. Matisse's Blue Nude deeply offended both the public and the critics. But 20 years later, Matisse did a series of odalisques, harem slaves or concubines that delighted both the critics and the public. Before you, two from that series. The colorful Middle Eastern textiles draped over the walls, the floor, and the furniture of Matisse's studio not only enforced the concept of a geographically vague Orient, but also, as Matisse said, played a role equivalent to and just as important as the female nude. Over a lifetime, Matisse's mastery of the expressive language of color has won him recognition as one of the two leading figures of 20th century art. Matisse finished this painting, Woman in a Purple Coat, in 1937. His model and muse was the young and beautiful Lydia Lektorskaya. Matisse has dressed Lydia in an exotic Moroccan costume and placed her against a wall of abstract designs in brilliant colors. Matisse was very pleased with both Lydia and the paintings that she inspired. But there was a problem. Madame Matisse was aware that Matisse was having an affair with Lydia. She confronted him saying, "Henri, you must choose her or me." Matisse's response, "Madame, my apologies, her." And now, I'd like to keep the promise I made at the beginning of this talk, if it's not too late, and close with a few remarks about Picasso. Picasso's life was filled with multiple romantic liaisons, 2 marriages, and at least 5 long-time, often overlapping relationships. It is, in fact, a widely held view that Picasso drew inspiration from each of these relationships and that a renewed creative period accompanied each new muse. Let me introduce the muses. Here at 1 o'clock, his first great love, Fernand Olivier. Then at 3 o'clock came sweet Eva Guel. He married, 5 o'clock, Olga Koklova. 10 years later, he fell in love with Marie-Thérèse Walter, the statuesque blonde you see in that bathing suit. Next, at 9 o'clock, came beautiful Dora Maar. She was followed, 11 o'clock, by Françoise Gillot, with whom he had 2 children. And finally, at midnight, Jacqueline Roch, who became his wife and the very last muse when he was 79 and she 34. And here is Picasso encircled by his muses. Let me tell you a little bit about each of these ladies. Picasso was young. He was only 23 when he met Fernande. She was the inspiration for his Rose period and early Cubist paintings and sculptures. Their relationship was tempestuous. It lasted 7 or 8 years. 20 years later, in 1931, Fernande wrote a series of memoirs about their life together. Picasso paid her to not publish any of them until they were both dead. At the right, you see Picasso's head of a woman. Fernande, of course, was the model. Picasso fell in love with Eva Goel in 1911 while he was still living with Fernande. He publicly declared his love for Eva in the Cubist painting Ma Jolie. You see it written there at the bottom of the painting. Eva died of tuberculosis in 1915 at the age of 30. In 1917, while Picasso was in Rome designing the sets for Erik Satie's ballet Parade, he met Olga Koklova. She was a dancer with the Ballet Russe. They married, they had a son they called Paolo, and they proceeded to live a life of conflict. Divorce, according to French law, meant dividing the estate equally between husband and wife. Picasso refused. And so they remained legally and unhappily married until Olga's death in 1955. At the left, you see a photograph of Olga and Picasso in happier times, and to the right, this beautiful portrait of Olga that Picasso did. It really is gorgeous. In 1927, 46-year-old Picasso met 17-year-old Marie-Thérèse. His opening gambit was, so we're told, "You have an interesting face. I would like to paint you." Picasso was still living with Olga when Marie-Thérèse became his muse and the mother of his first daughter, Maya. That relationship would end when 9 years later, in 1936, he would meet Dora Maar. At the left, you see Marie-Thérèse at the beach, and at the right, Picasso's Femme Fleur, a portrait of blonde, blue-eyed, lovely Marie-Thérèse. This is Dora Maar. She was a young Yugoslavian photographer who had studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and she was greatly influenced by surrealism. She met Picasso in 1935. She became his muse and inspiration for the next 7 years. She photographed him working in his studio, and she documented him creating Guernica, the famous anti-war painting I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. Dora Maar suffered a series of nervous breakdowns, and in her later years, she became a recluse. She was the inspiration for the Weeping Women series. And at the right, that's Dora Maar from that series, Weeping Women. Françoise Gillot was a 22-year-old art student when she and Picasso met in a cafe in 1943. Picasso was 62 years old, 40 years older. Their attraction, at first intellectual, quickly developed into a romance, and a few years later, Gillot moved in with Picasso. They had 2 children, a son, Claude, and a daughter, Paloma, the Tiffany jewelry designer. Eventually, Françoise grew weary of Picasso's temper and extramarital excursions, and in 1953, she took the children and walked out. Françoise has the distinction of being the first woman to walk out on Picasso. 11 years later, she published her tell-all book, Life with Picasso. Predictably, Picasso was furious, and he fractured both his relationship with her and with his two children. Françoise went on to marry Dr. Jonas Salk, the American physician who developed the first successful vaccine for polio. At your left, you see that famous photograph of Françoise at the beach and Picasso, in better times, cavalierly shielding her from the sun. And at the right, that's the most beautiful drawing of Françoise by Picasso. And finally, Jacqueline Roch. Picasso met Jacqueline in 1953 at the Madura pottery factory in the south of France, where he was busy making his ceramics. Picasso was 79 years old, Jacqueline 34. Jacqueline was married, but obligingly divorced and became Picasso's second wife. Picasso, inspired by Roch, created more works based on her than any other woman. Jacqueline is, in fact, the only woman that Picasso painted during the last 17 years of his life. Picasso died in April 1973. Jacqueline forbade Paloma and Claude, his children with Françoise, from attending their father's funeral. Why? Remember, Picasso had disinherited them after the publication of François' book, Life with Picasso. But in 1986, 13 years after Picasso's death, Jacqueline Roch, despondent, shot herself. At the left, a photograph of Jacqueline and Picasso at a bullfight. At the right, Jacqueline and Picasso embracing, of course, by Picasso. The artists that I've spoken about this afternoon, each in its own way, defy conventional or acceptable polite behavior. Often, they behave in the most shocking, startling, and reprehensible manner. But we shrug our shoulders and we forgive them, for they are prodigiously gifted, and they see the world through a different set of lenses. In the end, they show us a new way to see, and they gift us with lasting pleasures. I close with this photograph of the 13 artists, a baker's dozen, I've spoken about today. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation of Art's Bad Boys. Thank you so much. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you.